Hello everybody, it is TV Tuesday, and today we are talking about Spider-Man, the animated series from 1994, specifically seasons 1 and 2. Originally my plan was to do all 5 seasons. That didn't happen. I just finished the second season, and it is less than 2 hours than the day that this video is supposed to go up, so we're stopping at 2 seasons. My current plan is for seasons 3 through 5, to have my video up for that when Spider-Man No Way Home comes out. But we'll see. So I've got some notes. I don't know how long this is going to take. TV shows are weird to talk about. But something I'm going to kind of do in this is compare it to Batman the Animated Series. Now that might not be fair to this, and I realize that I haven't actually posted my videos on Batman the Animated Series yet, but very recently, before I watched this show, I watched Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series. So those are fresh in my mind, and I think it's helpful to me, at least in expressing my thoughts, to compare and contrast between those two shows. So look for videos on Batman the Animated Series when the new Batman movie comes out. Which, if you're watching this video in the far future, it might already be there. But if you're watching not in the far future, I think it's March of 2022. But anyway, we're not talking exclusively about Batman. We're talking about Spider-Man. Both shows have great theme songs. And I hesitate to say which one is better. But I will say, as an adult and as a musician, right, I think the Batman theme song is a better theme. It's more intense, it's more thematic. But as a kid, this Spider-Man theme song is radical. The talk box going on, Spider-Man, radio. It's so cool. It's so cool, and I don't even really have memories of watching this show, but I remember that theme song. It's awesome. Nothing against the Batman theme. It's a great theme, but this is just, it's radical, right? It's so 90s. The biggest, again, comparing these two shows, the biggest weakness, I think, of this show, especially compared to something like Batman the Animated Series, is that it's very hard to tell when Peter Parker / Spider-Man is talking and when he's thinking, and the difference between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Batman the Animated Series did a great job of differentiating between Bruce Wayne and Batman. I think a lot of that was on Kevin Conroy. I think that was his idea. But it's great, because in the show, you can clearly tell which character is talking. It helps set the mood for the scene. And, it helps overall, throughout the show, it helps the concept that when he's alone, when he's talking with Alfred, he's Batman, and Bruce Wayne is the act, right? But here, both Spider-Man and Peter Parker, the voice is exactly the same, there's no change, but there's a lot of inner monologue that we hear that there's no indication of in the show that he's not actually talking. And when he's Peter Parker, obviously, if his mouth isn't moving, then he's probably thinking, not talking. But when he's Spider-Man, his entire face is covered. And so there are it's hard to tell, especially depending on the scene, if he's saying something or if he's thinking something. And that can change how you interpret a scene, and it can be confusing when it takes you a minute to realize that, oh, he's not thinking that, he said that out loud. Or, oh, he didn't say that out loud, he was just thinking it. And it seems so obvious now, after watching the Batman animated series, just do the voices differently, right? Have a Spider-Man voice and have a Peter Parker voice, and then we'll know that when he's Spider-Man but he's thinking, it's the Peter Parker voice, because unlike Batman, he is Peter Parker and Spider-Man's the mask, right? So that would work, but at the time, I don't know when Batman the Animated Series started. I don't know if it started before this or at the same time or after, but I don't think that was a common thing. And so it just wasn't done. But I think that's the biggest hindrance to this series, is understanding the difference between those two characters and speech and thought, just because it's disorienting sometimes. So I started taking notes on individual episodes. I'm not really going to get into that because I watched 2 seasons of it. I like how the spider sense is portrayed in this show. It's very clear. It's very obvious, unlike some of the movies that chose not to do it. So I wrote down a note that says, back when cartoons just put in stuff from the comics. And that's mostly a reference to character design and costumes, right? And nowadays it seems like every show has to do their own unique version. And I get that. And I get that there's also not just one version in the comics anymore. But like, man, what a simpler time when Electro looked like Electro in the comics and in the TV show. And Doc Ock just looked like Doc Ock. And I know for a lot of people, the DCAU, the DC Animated Universe, is like the definitive versions of most of those characters. And I feel like for me, this TV show, even more so than the comics, is the definitive version, at least the definitive look of these characters for me. But I don't know how much I watched this show as a kid. I don't remember. But I think for me, it wasn't so much watching the show. It was the action figures. Because my dad had so many action figures specifically from this show. And like, that's what I remember as a kid. Like, I remember reading comics, and I remember watching stuff like this, and like the X-Men animated series, and like Justice League and Batman Beyond, but like, what got me to love superheroes was playing with the action figures. And like, I get that sounds dumb, probably, but like, that was it. That was my gateway in. That was how I expressed my creativity, rather than just watching or reading something else. I came up with, like, my storylines, right? And so many of those action figures are from this show. And I wrote down a list. I don't feel like I need to read them all off, but like Lizard, Smythe, Doc Ock, Mysterio. I said I don't feel the need to, but I'm gonna read a bunch of them off. Mysterio, Scorpion, Kraven, Hobgoblin, Rhino. At this point in the show, I haven't gotten to Black Cat, but we have Felicia Hardy. So I don't know if the Black Cat figure that I remember is the design from this show, but I wouldn't be surprised. Morbius. Venom, Carnage, Electro, Shocker, Hydro-Man, Vulture. Again, Prowler I haven't gotten to in this show, but I feel like that action figure. Like, these characters, the version of them in my head comes from those action figures, and those action figures come from this show. And I realize that most of what's in this show comes from the comics, but I feel like there's a difference between something on a still page and something animated, and so I feel like the show is a bigger influence on those action figures, and therefore a bigger influence on my identification and perception of these characters. That was a very long time spent on the point of just, this is what I think of when I think of these characters are from this show, via the action figures that I played with when I was a kid. Oh, goodness me. I wrote down at one point J. Jonah is Santa. The guy that does the voice of J. Jonah Jameson played Santa in Elf. I think he just died very recently, within the last couple weeks. I forget what his name was. But I think that was the same guy. So, rest in peace, J. Jonah Jameson. Oh, okay. So I wrote down at one point, Felicia shouldn't like Peter, because my understanding of Felicia Hardy Black Cat is that they love Spider-Man, and I guess more of a particular era, but during that era, Mary Jane loved Peter Parker. So Peter Parker was torn between these two girls, but Felicia Hardy didn't want anything to do with Peter Parker. That's my understanding. I haven't read a lot of comics with Black Cat, so maybe I'm misinformed on that. But I found it weird that in this show, Felicia Hardy is such a big and recurring love interest for Peter Parker, whereas I kind of think of her almost more like Flash, where she doesn't really care for Peter Parker. She likes Spider-Man specifically. we have a lot of villains in this show. This is something I think that this show does better than the Batman show. We have a lot of villains that are introduced and in the world far in advance of when they become villains. Batman did that a little bit with like Harvey Dent. I want to say maybe Pamela Isley, maybe Selena Kyle, like we're in there. But for the most part, it was just like, here's a new villain. And there's plenty of that in Spider-Man also, where it's just, here's a new villain. But I wrote down a couple examples. We have Eddie Brock far before he becomes Venom. And 2 seasons in, we still haven't gotten Green Goblin, but Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn have been in the show throughout. We've got Felicia Hardy, 2 seasons in, still hasn't become the Black Cat. We had Smythe, who was in kind of before he worked for the Kingpin. Michael Morbius was on for several episodes, but I think it was at least a few episodes before he became Morbius, the living vampire. And Vulture, even though Adrian Toomes didn't show up until the episode that featured the Vulture, the Toomes Foundation was a recurring element throughout the whole second season. So while we certainly have plenty of villains of the week and things like that, I think the show does a good job of putting characters into the world that will later become villains. And it's interesting to compare it to Batman's rogue. I think of all the superhero rogues galleries, Batman is probably the best, and Spider-Man, I think, is right there behind him. And what's interesting, at least in the versions of these characters that I'm familiar with, is that most of the time you could argue that Batman's villains were created in response to Batman, right? Batman shows up as this caped crime fighter, so the criminals have to get weirder to match it, right? Whereas in Spider-Man, at least in this show, but I think it probably is true in most forms, while a lot of them might be connected in some way to Peter Parker, most of them are not created as a response to Spider-Man. Most of them are done via J. Jonah Jameson, or the Kingpin, or Norman Osborn, or various other scientists. Who was the... There's a big mob boss in this that plays kind of a big part in the second season. Can't remember his name. His daughter's in it for a while. I don't think I wrote it down. He works with like Hammerhead and Tombstone, and I can't remember the main guy's name. Anyway, lost my train of thought. It's like the world is what creates these villains, and Spider-Man goes to respond to them, right? And he goes and he meets them. So I think it's interesting that these, what I would consider the 2 most famous rogues galleries, kind of come from 2 different places. But I think both of those fit those characters well. I don't think one is better than the other. I think it's interesting to have both. And to have good versions of both. We do get a lot of weird things, like when he's falling and, he forgets he has web shooters. The Batman series does that a lot also, where it forgets he has a grappling gun. So, no hate on the show for that. I'm skipping a lot of my notes because a lot of them were episode specific and I don't really want to focus on that. Venom. So Venom comes in at the end of the first season and it's intense. Like, he is just owning Spider-Man. And like, I was really curious. I'm like, how is he gonna, like, I get that kids ask that question a lot. Like, oh my gosh, how's he gonna get out of this one? But like, legitimately, I was like, how is he going to get over this? And I don't remember, but I feel like Venom just kind of backs off and just kind of lets him, says something threatening about how he'll be back or whatever. But he's not in the second season. So that was kind of not very well paid off yet. It might come back in a future season. But like, Venom was just super intense in this show. And I have a note that just says Mark Hamill is Hobgoblin. I had no memory of that, but like, both of these shows, Spider-Man and Batman, going on about the same time, and I think Hobgoblin is more prominent in this show than in the comics. I feel like he kind of takes the role of Green Goblin, or what I would expect would be the role of Green Goblin in this show. But with Hobgoblin, you can have him more doing stuff with Kingpin that Green Goblin probably wouldn't do. This is really too much of a deep dive. But one of the main recurring villains in this show, and while not the Green Goblin, which is Spider-Man's probably most famous villain, kind of a combination of Hobgoblin and Green Goblin. So the fact that you have Mark Hamill playing one of Spider-Man's, or a version of one of Spider-Man's greatest foes, and also voicing the Joker, one of Batman's greatest foes. Way to go, Mark Hamill. Like, nice work. Then I got into season 2. So season 2, it starts with this like Sinister Six storyline where we have people breaking these super criminals out of jail, and it's so funny because we get, I don't remember all of them exactly, but we get like Dr. Otto Octavius, blah blah blah, right? And Mac Gargan, the Scorpion, and you know, Quentin Beck, and I can't remember Electro's name, which is ironic because that's such a big deal in the Amazing Spider-Man 2. Max Dillon? Is that it? Anyway, we see all these villains who are identified by name, and they're like in their civilian clothes or whatever, and they have to be given their suits, other than things like, you know, Rhino, who can't get out of his suit or whatever. But then they get to the Shocker, who's just in his suit in prison, and they don't use his name. They're just like, Shocker! And it's not worth this much time in this video. I just thought that was hilarious that we get the civilian identities and names and you know, like outside of costume, we're reintroduced to all these characters. And it's like, oh, and also Shocker. The audience doesn't know or care who you are, what you look like, but you shoot shocks, so you're coming too. I just found it kind of funny. A lot of the second season revolves around the idea of Spider-Man losing his powers, which obviously was explored in the Raimi films. It takes place over a longer period of time in this show because that's something that TV shows can do. But again, this is one of the things that it really makes you notice, like, the show kind of just forgets that he has web shooters, and they try to explain it away as to why he can't use them as much. But like, still, if you're falling and you can't stick to the side of a building, you can still use your web shooter. Come on now. And then the second season, I didn't realize how expansive this was. I feel like everybody knows about the DCAU and how they all cross over and stuff like that, but like, there's an X-Men crossover in this show, and I haven't rewatched the X-Men animated series as an adult. I don't remember how much of it I saw as a kid. I know I saw some of it, but I don't have a lot of memory from that show. But the theme song from it is playing in these episodes, so I feel like it's probably the same versions in this episode. And I'm like, was this a thing? Was there a Marvel animated TV universe like the DC one? What other shows are in it? And like, I kind of tried to look it up. I didn't see anything, so it might have just been a crossover. But I feel like that's worth exploring. But then we get a bunch more I say guest stars, but it's just more heroes and not just villains all the time. So we get the Punisher, who they had to nerf quite a bit for this show, but still kind of cool. And we get Blade, who's so... The only version of Blade I know is the Wesley Snipes version from the movies. I've never read comics with Blade. That's it. And this version is so different, and I don't say that as a dig, but like, he drives a motorcycle that can drive up walls and on buildings and stuff like that, which like, to me feels very Ghost Rider. But the thing that sticks out is that he uses what's basically a lightsaber, like this energy blade. And I would have found that so bizarre, except for the fact that maybe a week or so ago, I was watching a video from Mr. Sunday Movies and their Caravan at Garbage, where they're playing a very, very, very old Marvel like arcade game, and one of the characters in that game is Blade, and in that game he's got this energy sword, and James asks, he's like, was this something that he had? And Mason, who has read a lot more comics, explains that yeah, that was a thing that happened in the 90s. And so it's so bizarre and it's so weird, and it's something that I don't think of as part of the Blade character at all. And if it hadn't been for that other video, I would have been so confused and so lost. But once it popped up, I was just like, okay, I guess this was just that time of the 90s where Blade had a lightsaber and drove a motorcycle that could climb up walls. And then the last note that I wrote down today was, Peter is whiny and has it too easy with the girls. So I've said plenty of times that I don't particularly care for the original trilogy of Star Wars movies because Luke Skywalker is a whiny baby. And I know that part of Spider-Man's character is that he has problems and that things are always going wrong. And I remember that from the comics, but I don't remember him being so whiny about it. And that might be that I'm misremembering, but I feel like it's how the voice actor is portraying the character. But particularly with Mary Jane and Felicia Hardy. Because this boy has so many chances with both of them that he keeps screwing up over and over again, and then he just gets more chances. And every episode he's like, oh, I can't believe I blew it with Mary Jane, and oh my gosh, how could I turn on Felicia Hardy, like blah 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 blah. And it gets so tired. And again, maybe I'm misremembering stuff from the comics. I didn't read far enough to get to either of those characters. The bulk of what I've read Spider-Man, like Betty Brant was the main interest. But like, those aren't problems that you have, dude. Like, you're the problem there. Stop whining, and if you want to do something, do something. But like, so many times in this show, there's a character who's going to go out with this character, but then this character does something that the other character doesn't like, or is a little bit later, whatever. And so instead of, talking and having a conversation and being like, hey, you hurt me, blah, 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 they're just like, all right, who's the next first person that I see? Okay, you're taking me out now. And like, I guess that happens, right? And it's like a college campus, so I kind of get, but like, this is a kid's show. Is that the message we want to teach the children? That's like, hey, if somebody that you're interested in does literally anything, even a little bit wrong, immediately go to the very next person that you see just to make them jealous. And like, if it had happened a couple times and then characters learned and grew from that, fine. But it happens like every episode, and it just gets kind of annoying, and it makes me not like Peter Parker or Mary Jane or Felicia Hardy. And I'm just like, Deb and Flash. Let's go, Deb and Flash. Come on, you guys. I think that's it. I think that's what I got for seasons 1 and 2 of Spider-Man, the animated series. I look forward to watching the next few seasons. I didn't even mention the second season. It's like a long-term storyline, which I feel like is rare for kids shows, especially back in the 90s. The first season was a lot more episodic. It had a couple recurring things coming back. But the second season was very much like what you would think of as an adult superhero show. One long story with, little things happening in between, but very much connected. And I know at least the third season looks like it's going to be similar to that. I hope it's like that moving forward, because that's cool. That's great. I like it when kids shows can understand that they're a kids show, but they can still do more serious storytelling and take themselves a little bit more seriously and don't have to just not try at everything. So very much looking forward to the next 3 seasons. But that's where I'm going to stop this video. So those are my thoughts on Spider-Man the Animated Series, Seasons 1 and 2. Let me know what your thoughts are. That's everything that I have to say. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day. Hey everybody, Sam Tom here. Just wanted to let you know that I have 2 channels. If you're watching my music content, I also have a movie channel where I talk about movies and TV shows. If you're watching my movie content, I have a music channel where I do song covers, instrument demos, things like that. So feel free to check that out. Obviously, like, share, subscribe, comment, all that YouTube stuff. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.